They told him to leave. The words fell sharp and cold, like stones hurled against the chest of a man who had already carried too much weight in his lifetime. The restaurant manager's voice carried across the quiet dining hall, each syllable biting with impatience. An old man, worn boots, trembling hands, threadbare jacket. He did not belong here, the manager insisted. Not among the polished tables, the polished shoes, the polished customers who glanced over their menus and then quickly away, unwilling to meet the eyes of a man whose silence was heavier than any protest. He stood there with a faint tremor in his jaw, his posture still upright though his bones seemed ready to surrender. He had asked for nothing more than a seat. Just a seat, nothing extravagant, just the chance to rest his tired legs and taste a warm meal. Yet the refusal was swift, dismissive. His presence, they claimed, disturbed the image of refinement. What no one could see, at least not yet, was the quiet storm moving beneath his stillness. A life etched into scars invisible to those who judged him. He bore himself with the remnants of an old discipline, shoulders squared, gaze steady even as humiliation pressed against his ribs. The air thickened with unease as a few diners looked on, sensing the wrongness of it, but doing nothing. Their silence was a different kind of wound, an absence of defense when defense mattered most. The old man, whose name few knew and fewer cared to ask, had been through storms that made this moment feel like a child's cruelty. Yet it still hurt. His mind flashed to nights in foreign deserts where sand and blood mixed in his mouth, to mornings where the screams of comrades lingered long after the gunfire fell silent, to promises he had whispered over folded flags, promises to never forget those who did not return home. His silence in this dining hall was not submission. It was armor. Armor forged from grief, from sacrifice, from the burden of survival. Once, decades earlier, his body had been strong enough to shield others. Once, his hands had carried more than just the weight of a fork and a spoon. He had carried the weight of brothers. He had carried the wounded through chaos, dragged men bleeding through smoke, lifted voices when silence would have meant death. He had been young then, young and unbroken, and fierce in his loyalty to the uniform that had become his second skin. But time had whittled him down. His frame was lean, his hair the color of ash, his heart slower but still steady. Those watching him now saw only an old man in shabby clothes. They did not see the nights he had gone without sleep because memories stalked him like wolves. They did not see the faces of friends frozen in photographs tucked away in a weathered wallet. They did not see the letter he kept folded in his pocket, creased and worn, written by a comrade who never made it back. And so the manager's demand cut sharper than it should have. It was not merely an order to leave. It was a dismissal of everything he had been, everything he had carried, everything he still carried even now. The old man did not argue. He simply stood, eyes lowered, hand reaching for the cane that leaned beside him. There was a murmur among the tables. Some shook their heads but said nothing. Some looked away, ashamed but unwilling to act. It was easier to let one man be shamed than to step into the current of conflict. But then silence shifted. From a corner table, 6 men rose as one. Their movement was quiet, unannounced, but the air seemed to change the moment their chairs slid back. They wore civilian clothes, dark jackets, pressed shirts, nothing extraordinary, but there was something unmistakable in their bearing. Straight backs, eyes sharpened by discipline, zurats, a weight in their silence that was different from the silence of the crowd. They walked forward without hurry, without words, their presence speaking louder than any protest. The manager faltered, confusion flickering across his face as the 6 men formed a line beside the old veteran. One placed a steady hand on the old man's shoulder. Another, tall and broad, lifted the cane gently and pressed it into his palm. None of them spoke, and yet their silence was thunder. Their silence was command. They were Navy SEAL, though no one in the room needed to be told. The truth was in the way they carried themselves, in the unspoken unity of their step, in the reverence with which they now stood beside the man who had been told to leave. They did not announce it, did not brandish titles or medals. They simply stood there, unmoving, unshakable. And suddenly the dynamic shifted. The weight of the room pressed not on the old man anymore, but on those who had chosen to look away. Customers straightened in their seats, guilt pricking their spines. The manager's words seemed to hang in the air, brittle, foolish, dissolving under the pressure of 6 silent men who had faced storms most would never endure. The old man's eyes, damp now, lifted slightly. He did not speak, but the corners of his lips trembled, caught between sorrow and gratitude. He had thought his years of service forgotten, his sacrifices erased by the march of time. Yet here, in the quiet solidarity of 6 younger warriors, he felt the unbroken chain of brotherhood. One generation saluting another without a single word. The silence grew unbearable, but in the most beautiful way, it forced truth into the open. Respect was not demanded here. It was commanded by the stillness of men who understood what sacrifice meant. Finally, the old man's hand tightened on his cane. His voice, when it came, was soft but steady. He said only this: "That silence is sometimes the loudest salute." The words lingered, carried by the weight of every story hidden in his bones. People felt their throats tighten. Some bowed their heads. A mother pulled her child closer, whispering that they were watching something important. The manager, red-faced, tried to regain his footing, stammering apologies that sounded hollow in the charged air. But no one was listening anymore. All eyes were on the veteran and the 6 men who had risen for him. In that moment, justice required no argument, no raised voices, no confrontation. Justice stood tall in silence, in unity, in the quiet power of dignity that cannot be stripped away. The old man was offered a seat again, but he did not sit. Instead, he looked at the 6 who stood beside him, and a faint smile broke across his weathered face. He touched his hand lightly to his chest, a gesture of gratitude, a gesture of brotherhood, and together they turned, walking out, not in defeat, but in victory. The entire room rose to their feet as they passed. Chairs scraped the floor as diners stood, not because anyone told them to, but because something deep within demanded it. Respect, long dormant, awakened in the silence left behind. Some stories do not end with battles won or medals awarded. Some stories end in quiet acts of defiance, in small but unforgettable moments, when dignity triumphs over disrespect. That night, an old man, who had given his youth to protect strangers, was reminded that his sacrifice had not been forgotten. And 6 silent men reminded the world that honor does not grow old, does not fade, does not need words to be recognized. For those watching, the lesson remained long after. Respect is not owed to titles or appearances, but to sacrifice. Silent strength can move more than words ever could. And sometimes, share what this story means to you. And remember, sometimes silence is the loudest voice of all.